Hello, everybody. This is Empowering Democracy. I'm your host, Joe Firestone. And tonight I'll talk about Jeffrey Sachs on Economic Convergence and Alistair Crooke and Pepe Escobar on reality biting. Reality biting where it hurts. Anyway, those are our topics. I'm going to start off with a piece from Jeffrey Sachs. On the United States, BRICS, and the world economy. I picked it up at LA Progressive on June 10th, 2024. The world economy is experiencing a deep process of economic convergence. Regions that once lacked the West in industrialization are now making up for lost time. And there is a lovely picture of people crossing the street in a big city. I don't know why that picture suddenly changed, but it seems to be a little video. The World Bank's release on May 30th of its latest estimates of national output up to the year 2022 offers an occasion to reflect on the new geopolitics. The new data underscore the shift from a U.S.-led world economy to a multipolar world economy, a reality that U.S. strategists have so far failed to recognize, accept, or admit. The World Bank figures make clear that the economic dominance of the West is over. In 1994, the G7 countries, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, UK, and the US, constituted 45% of world output, compared to 18.9% of world output in the BRICS countries, Brazil, China, Egypt, Ethiopia, India, Iran, Russia, South Africa, and the United Arab Emirates. The tables have turned. The BRICS now produce 35.2% of world output, while the G7 countries produce 29.3% of world output. There's another article referred to there, BRICS versus the G7, power struggles and not class struggles. As of 2022, the largest five economies in descending order are China, the US, India, Russia, and Japan. Japan's GDP is around 25% larger than the US, roughly 30% of the US GDP per person, but with 4.2 times the population. 3 of the top 5 countries are in the BRICS, while 2 are in the G7. In 1994, the largest 5 were the US, Japan, China, Germany, and India, with 3 in the G7 and 2 in the BRICS. As the shares of world output change, so too does global power. The core US-led alliance, which includes the US, Canada, UK, European Union, Japan, Korea, Australia, and New Zealand, was 56% of world output in 1994, but now is only 39.5%. As a result, the US global influence is waning. As a recent vivid example, when the US-led group introduced economic sanctions on Russia in 2022, very few countries outside the core alliance joined. As a result, Russia had little trouble shifting its trade to countries outside the US-led alliance. The world economy is experiencing a deep process of economic convergence. according to which regions that once lagged the West in industrialization in the 19th and 20th centuries are now making up for lost time. Economic convergence actually began in the 1950s as European imperial rule in Africa and Asia came to an end. It has proceeded in waves, starting first in East Asia, then roughly 20 years later India, and for the coming 20 to 40 years in Africa. These and some other regions are growing much faster than the Western economies since they have more headroom to boost GDP by rapidly raising education levels, boosting worker skills, and installing modern infrastructure, including universal access to electrification and digital platforms. The emerging economies are often able to leapfrog the richer countries with state-of-the-art infrastructure, e.g. fast intercity rail, 5G, modern airports and seaports, while the richer countries remain stuck with aging infrastructure and expensive retrofits. The IMF's World Economic Outlook projects that the emerging and developing countries will average growth around 4% in the coming 5 years, while the high-income countries will average less than 2% per year. It's not only in skills and infrastructure that convergence is occurring. Many of the emerging economies, including China, Russia, Iran, and others, are advancing rapidly in technological innovations as well as in both civilian and military technologies. China has a large lead in the manufacturing of cutting-edge technologies needed for the global energy transition, including batteries, electric vehicles, 5G, photovoltaics, wind turbines, fourth-generation nuclear power, and others. China's rapid advances in space technology, thanks, honey, biotechnology, nanotechnology, and other technologies is similarly impressive. In response, the U.S. has made the absurd claim that China has an overcapacity, quote unquote, in these cutting-edge technologies. Whoever thought that was a good idea? I can't believe it was Janet Yellen. Well, the obvious truth is that the U.S. has a significant undercapacity in many sectors. China's capacity for innovation and low-cost production is underpinned by enormous R&D spending and its vast and growing labor force of scientists and engineers. Despite the new global economic realities, the U.S. security state still pursues a grand strategy of, quote, primacy, unquote. That is the aspiration of the U.S. to be the dominant economic, financial, technological, and military power in every region of the world. The U.S. is still trying to maintain primacy in Europe by surrounding Russia in the Black Sea region with NATO forces. Yet Russia has resisted this on a military basis in both Georgia and Ukraine. The U.S. is still trying to maintain primacy in Asia by surrounding China in the South China Sea, a folly that can lead the U.S. into a disastrous war over Taiwan. The U.S. is also losing its standing in the Middle East by resisting the united call of the Arab world for recognition of Palestine as the 194th United Nations member state. Yet primacy is certainly not possible today and was hubristic even 30 years ago, when U.S. relative power was much greater. Today, the U.S. share of world output stands at 14.8%, compared with 18.5% for China, and the U.S. share of world population is a mere 4.1%, compared with 17.8% for China. The trend toward global economic convergence means that U.S. hegemony will not be replaced by Chinese hegemony. Indeed, China's share of world output is likely to peak at around 20% during the coming decade, and thereafter decline as China's population declines. Other parts of the world, notably including India and Africa, are likely to show a large rise in their respective shares of global output, and with that, in their geopolitical weight as well. We're therefore entering a post-hegemonic, multipolar world. By the way, this is a wonderful summary of what's happened, I believe, by Jeffrey. It, too, is fraught with challenges. It could usher in a new, quote, tragedy of great power politics in which several nuclear powers compete in vain for hegemony. It could lead to a breakdown of fragile global rules, such as open trade under the World Trade Organization, or it could lead to a world in which the great powers exercise um, 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 tolerance, restraint, and even cooperation in accord with the UN Charter, because they recognize that only such statecraft will keep the world safe, okay, in the nuclear age. Well, that first article introduces us to the reality of the world in which we live. It's a great summary of what that reality consists, and it contains the economic reasons why we say that a multipolar world is emerging right now and why that cannot be denied. So, keeping that in mind, let us move now to the second of the articles, which is not an article about reality or the new reality that we live in, but which is an article about sheer denial. That is, the article is not about denying anything, but it describes, uh, the denial that is currently taking place. It's called Israel and the mismanagement of reality, and it's by Alistair Crooke, the former diplomat from the UK. It's from June 10th, 2024, and I picked it up at the UN's Review. Here's a photo of people marching in the street, Israeli citizens marching in the street. The hard truth is that the resistance has understood the reality of the situation better than their Western counterparts. That's the caption. On all fronts, the Israeli internal paradigm is fracturing, and externally, the West is itself fissuring and becoming a pariah on the global stage. The Western leadership's explicit facilitation of a bloody cleansing of Palestine has incised the old specter of Orientalism and colonialism onto the skyline, and is gyring the West towards being the world's, quote, untouchable, unquote, of course, along with Israel. Overall, Israel's government objective looks to be to converge and then channel multiple tensions into a wide military escalation, disgorgement, a big war that somehow would bring a restoration of deterrence. Such a course concomitantly implies that Israel would thus turn its back to Western pleas, that it somehow act, quote, reasonably, unquote. The West mostly defines this reasonableness, quote unquote, as Israel accepting the chimera of a passage to normality, quote unquote, arriving through the Saudi crown prince bestowing it in return for a contrite Israel undoing 7 decades of Jewish supremacism, i.e., accepting a Palestinian state. The core tension with the Western Israeli calculus is that the United States and the EU are moving in one direction, back to the failed Oslo approach, whilst Pauling underscores Jewish electors firmly marching in the other direction. A recent survey conducted by the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs shows that since October 7th, 79% of all Jewish respondents oppose the establishment of a Palestinian state on 1967 lines. 68% were opposed prior to the 7th of October. 74% are opposed, even in exchange for normalization with Saudi Arabia, and reflective of the internal Israeli divide. Quote, only 24% of left-wing supporters support a Palestinian state without conditions, unquote. In short, as the Western institutional leadership clings to the shrinking Israeli secular liberal left, Israelis as a whole, including the young, are moving hard right. The recent Pew poll shows that 73% of the Israeli public support of the military in Gaza, albeit a third of Israel complained it had not gone far enough. Okay, a plurality of Israelis think Israel should govern the Gaza Strip, and Netanyahu, in the aftermath of the ICC arrest threat, is overtaking Gantz, leader of the National Union, in approval ratings. It seems that the, quote, Western consensus, unquote, prefers not to notice these uncomfortable dynamics. Additionally, a separate Israeli divide concerns the purpose of the war. Is it about restoring to Jewish citizens a sense of personal physical security which was lost in the wake of 7th of October? That is to say, is it the sense of Israel as a redoubt, safe place in a hostile world that is being restored, or alternatively, is the present struggle one of establishing a fully Judaicized Israel on the land of Israel, quote unquote, i.e., all the land between the river and the sea, the prime objective? This constitutes a key divide. Those who see Israel primarily as the safe redoubt to which Jews could flee in the wake of European Holocaust naturally are more circumspect at the risking of a wider war, i.e., with Hezbollah, a war that could see the civilian rear, quote unquote, directly attacked by Hezbollah's vast missile arsenal. For this constituency, safety is a premium. Safety is at a premium, perhaps. On the other hand, the majority of Israelis see the risk of wider war as inevitable, indeed to be welcomed by many, if the Zionist project is to be fully established on the land of Israel. This reality may be difficult for secular Westerners to grasp, but the 7th of October has re-energized the biblical vision in Israel rather than excite a surfeit of caution about war or a desire for rapprochement with the Arab states. The point here is that a new war of independence can be held aloft before the Israeli public as the metaphysical vision, quote unquote, of the way ahead, whilst the Israeli government attempts to pursue the more mundane path of playing the long game, leading to the full military matrix control over the land between the river and the sea, and the removal of populations that will not submit to it. May now be spoken of, I guess, as and the removal of populations that will not submit to the Smotrich dispensation of, quote, acquiesce or leave. The schism between Israel as a secular post-Holocaust safe space, quote unquote, and the contrasting biblical Zionist vision sets a border between the two zeitgeists that is both porous and at times overlaps. Nonetheless, this Israeli divide has bled across into U.S. politics and in a more scattered way has entered into European polity. For the Jewish diaspora living in the West, keeping Israel as a safe space is vitally important, as insofar as Israel becomes insecure, Jews feel their own personal insecurity worsens pari passu. In one sense, the Israeli projection of strong deterrence in the Middle East is an umbrella that extends to cover the diaspora as well. They want quiet in the region. The biblical vision, quote unquote, has an edge to it, which is frankly too polarizing. Yet those very power structures straining to sustain the Israeli strongman paradigm in the Western consciousness now find their efforts attending to shred those Western political structures on which they depend, thus alienating key constituencies, particularly the young. A recent poll amongst 18 to 24-year-olds in Britain found that a majority agreed that the state of Israel should not exist. Just 21% disagreed with this statement. That's a striking result, especially because if there were a war, most likely Britain would be drawing upon those 18 to 24-year-olds to go save the state of Israel. It doesn't match up very well with reality. The wielding of lobby power to compel Western united support for Israel and its deterrent objectives, coupled with the lack of human empathy for Palestinians, is inflicting heavy losses on institutional leadership structures as underlying mainstream parties fracture in different directions. The damage is exacerbated by the Western peace camp's, quote, reality blind spot, unquote. We heard all the time, the only solution is that of two states living peacefully side by side on the lines of 1967, as enshrined in UN Security Council resolutions 242 and 338. Also, apart from in the West, the same mantra is also rehearsed, as the peace camp reminds us, by the Arab League. It seems so simple. It is indeed simple, but only through ignoring the reality that such a Palestinian state can only come into sovereign being through force, through military force. The reality is that there are 750,000 settlers occupying the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and another 25,000 settlers living in Syria's Golan Heights. Who will remove them? Israel won't. They will fight to the last settler, many of whom are zealots. They were invited and placed there in the years since the 1973 war, largely by successive labor governments, precisely to obstruct any possible Palestinian state coming into existence. The question that those who say the solution is simple, two states living side by side in peace, do not answer. Has the West the will or the political resolve to instantiate a Palestinian state by force of arms against the current will of a plurality of Israelis? The answer, inevitably, is no. The West does not have the will, and the suspicion that arises that in their hearts they know this, there is perhaps a yearning for a solution and disquiet that absent, quote, common Gaza, unquote, tensions will spike, in the diaspora too. The hard truth is that the resistance has understood the reality of the situation better than their Western counterparts. The putative Palestinian state has only receded in prospect since the 1993 Oslo process, rather than having advanced a jot. Why did the West not take corrective action over 3 decades and only then recall the dilemma when it became a process? The resistance has better appreciated the inherent untenable contradiction of one people appropriating to themselves special rights and privileges over another, sharing the same land, and that such a scenario could not long persist without breaking this region apart. The resistance has better appreciated the inherent untenable contradiction of one people appropriating to themselves special rights and privileges over another, sharing the same land, and that such a scenario could not long persist without breaking the region apart. Witnessed the wars and devastations to which maintaining the existing paradigm already has led. The region stands at the edge, and events at any moment can push it over that edge, despite the efforts of regional actors to control incremental movement up the escalatory ladder. This is likely to be a long war, and a solution likely will only emerge through Israel, by one means or another, facing up to the inner paradigm contradiction within Zionism and to begin seeing the future differently. And of that there is as yet no sign. Very, very true, Alistair Crooke. Well describes the dilemma, well describes the situation there and the lack of perception of reality on the Israeli part. And not just on Israel's part, but on the part of the United States as well, on the part of Israeli allies. Nobody wants to look at the reality and say at this point, given the realities on the ground, a two-state solution is now impossible. And no one is even saying that the reason for this is the Israelis themselves. They made a two-state solution impossible by settling 750,000 Israelis on the Arab lands in the West Bank. 750,000 Israelis there. They are living among millions of Palestinians who are there. The only way you can have a two-state solution, in my view, is to move those settlers out of there. And it's hard to see that happening if the Israelis are to be responsible for doing it. So let's move now to our third piece. We are moving through things rapidly tonight. Hello, April. Glad you're here. Hello, Steve. I'm glad you're here too. We have a much larger audience than just the two of you, but they have yet to announce themselves, probably because a lot of them are on Twitter. And we don't get to see the Twitter commentary here. Maybe we will get to see that soon. But anyway, for the time being, we don't. So let us move to the third piece. Another really excellent piece by Pepe Escobar entitled The Summer of Living Dangerously. Obviously, the title is ripped off from, was it a 1970s film or an early 1980s film with Sigourney Weaver and I believe Mel Gibson, if I recall correctly, and Linda Hunt. Linda Hunt playing a very outstanding part. That was the year of Living Dangerously, and it was a movie about unrest, in Indonesia, and violence, and there's a lot of violence in Indonesia in that year, and people were victimized. And The Summer of Living Dangerously, June 12, 2024. I also picked it up at the UNS Review. And there is a caricature of Macron, the president of France, wearing a Napoleon hat with an M on top of it. The plutocracy believes that afterwards they can buy the whole thing for a pittance, while flies are still laying eggs in European carcasses. So the Petit Roi in France was predictably crushed in the European polls. He is called Parliamentary Snap Elections Dissolving the Assemblée Nationale in an act of blind, puerile revenge on French citizens, de facto attacking French institutional democracy. That doesn't mean much anyway, because the lineaments of liberty of, quote, liberty, equality, fraternity, unquote, have long been usurped by a crass oligarchy. Yes, of course, that was arranged by de Gaulle when he took over. The second round of these fresh French elections will be on July 7th, nearly coinciding with the British snap elections on July 11th, and only a few days before the slow-burning urban catastrophe, which will be the Olympics in Paris. Paris salons are ablaze with intrigue on why the little Rothschild stooge with the Napoleon complex is throwing all his toys out of the pram now because he's not getting what he wants. After all, what he craves is to become a, quote, war president, unquote, together with the cadaver in the White House, Starmer in the UK, Rutte in the Netherlands, the toxic Medusa von der Lugen, that is Medusa of the Lie, in Brussels, Tusk in Poland, without having to answer to the French people. It is nearly certain that Le Petit Roi will be facing the real prospect of becoming a lame duck president who needs to obey a right-wing parliament. Elysee Palace chatter already joined the circus, conveying the impression he might resign. That was later denied. Still, if Le Petit Roi runs off to war on Russia, no French citizen will follow him. Least of all, the pitiful French army. Bigger things are in play. Following the auspicious, game-changing messages to the global majority coming out of the St. Petersburg Forum last week, and remember we covered that in the last show, anchored on openness and inclusiveness, the BRICS 10 meeting of foreign ministers in Nizhny Novgorod carried the baton early this week. Foreign Minister Lavrov stressed three key points. The countries of the global south no longer want to be dependent on the double standards of the West and its whims. Two, everyone knows that the BRICS countries already serve as the locomotive of the world economy, unquote. We, at the BRICS foreign ministers meeting, stressed the need for consistent efforts to create a new world order where the equality of independent states will be the key, unquote. Now compare it with the shrinking G7 meeting later this week in Puglia in southern Italy. The same old song from a, quote, tough new warning, unquote, to Chinese banks, quote, don't do business with Russia or else, unquote, to vociferous threats against the China-Russia strategic partnership. And last but not least, extra plotting to skim interest from the massive frozen, stolen Russian assets with the intent of sending them to Country 404. Country 404 is Ukraine itself. It's called Country 404 because there is an inexorable error there. It's the error country, 404. The toxic Medusa itself announced that Country 404 will receive euros 1.5 billion of the income from stolen Russian assets from the EU in July, 90% of it to buy weapons. As for U.S. Deputy Secretary of State Kurt Campbell, the man who invented the defunct pivot to Asia, quote unquote, during Harpy Hillary Clinton's tenure in the early 2010s, he had already advanced that Washington will sanction Chinese companies and banks over Beijing's relations with Russia's military-industrial complex. False flags and perfect symmetry by several metrics, Europe is about to explode. Not with a bang, but an agonizing whimper anytime within the next few months. It's crucial to remember that the snap elections in France and Britain will also coincide with the NATO summit on July 11th, where Russophobia-fueled warmongerings will reach paroxysm. Among possible scenarios, some kind of false flag to be squarely blamed on Russia should be expected, It could be a Franz Ferdinand. Uh, but I bid you uh, sorry, some kind of false flag to be squarely blamed on Russia should be expected. It could be a Franz Ferdinand moment, a Gulf of Tonkin movement, or even a U.S. Maine before the American Spanish War moment. The fact remains that the only way these leaders, quote unquote, across NATO stand, plus their lowly MI6 agent in a green sweaty t shirt in Kiev, will survive. He always calls Zelensky the sweaty t shirt, will survive is by manufacturing a casus belli. If indeed that happens, a date can be advanced between the second week of July and the end of August, and certainly no later than the second week of September. October will be too late, too close to the U.S. elections, so be prepared for the summer of living dangerously. That's where the name comes from. Meanwhile, the bear is not exactly hibernating. President Putin, before and during the St. Petersburg Forum, elaborated on how symmetric, quote unquote, Moscow's response will be to attacks by Kiev using NATO Stand missiles already ongoing. There are 3 NATO Stand members which are supplying missiles with a range of 350 kilometers or more: the United States, UK, and France. So a, quote, symmetric, unquote, response would imply Russia providing global South nations with advanced weaponry capable of causing serious damage to nodes of the empire of bases. And here are the top candidates to receive these weapons, as extensively debated not only on Russian TV channels, but also in the St. Petersburg Forum corridors. West Asia, Iran, which already has them. Syria badly needs them. Also, Yemen, Iraq would be very helpful to Hashid al-Shabi, and so I point out, sorry, Central, Northeast, Southeast Asia, Afghanistan, also Myanmar. These 2 are present in St. Petersburg and North Korea. Latin America, Cuba, Venezuela, and also Nicaragua. Just look at the current Russian foray in the Caribbean. Africa, Central African Republic, Congo, Ethiopia, Somalia, Southern Sudan, and Zimbabwe. Just look at Lavrov's recent African tour. Mr. Zircon says hello is the next section. That brings us the jolly matter of a Russian naval force hanging out in the Caribbean, headed by the hypersonic missile-armed frigate Admiral Gorshkov and the Kazan nuclear submarine. The indispensable Andrei Martyanov has noted how the Gorshkov carries 32 Onyx, Zircon calibers, and Otvet. These are the most advanced and deadly cruise missiles in history, with a serious combat pedigree. Kazan, which is the Yasin class SSGN, carries also 32 VLS, and in addition has 10 torpedo tubes which can shoot not just torpedoes. Well, this naval force is obviously not there to launch World War III. Andrei Martyanov explains that, quote, while both can strike all of the eastern seaboard of the U.S. and Canada, they are there not for that reason. God forbid if it comes to real World War III, there are plenty of Bulavas, Vanguards, Sarmats, and Yarsis to deal with this horrifying business. Those are other super missiles of various kinds. No, both Gorshkov and Kazan are there to show that they can reach any combat ship or strategic sea lift vessel carrying any military combat set from North America to Europe in case of some nut job deciding to try to survive a conventional war with Russia uh, in 404, unquote. What's even more intriguing is that after spending time in Havana, the naval force will remain in the Caribbean for a series of exercises and will be joined by other Russian Navy vessels. They will remain in these waters until the end of the summer of living dangerously, just in case some nut job has fancy ideas. Wonder who that nut job might be. Meanwhile, the possible escalation towards hot war in Europe proceeds unabated, with NATO via its epileptic slab of Norwegian wood radically changing the established rules of proxy wars with one nonsense outburst after another. The armed forces of Ukraine, the AFU, are already capable via NATO to destroy both military and civilian Russian assets, oil storage, airports, energy facilities, railway junctions, even concentrations of troops. Everyone and his neighbor will be waiting for the symmetric responses. For all practical purposes, the crucial decision has been made by the rarefied plutocracy, which really runs the show: force Europe into war on Russia. That's the rationale behind all the rhetorical kabuki about a, quote, a military Schengen, unquote, and a new Iron Curtain from the Arctic through the Baltic Chihuahuas all the way to rabid Poland. The plutocracy actually believes that afterwards they can buy the whole thing for a pittance while flies are still laying eggs in radioactive European carcasses. Oh, these images from Pepe are overpowering and outstanding, but you get the picture. The reality of the Russian armed forces, of their missile technology, is biting at this point. And the U.S. may be considering intervening, maybe thinking that uh, something better be done before this die in Europe is really cast by Moscow. But on the other hand, there's no possibility of doing anything, okay, in the North Atlantic because the Russian forces that are there are too powerful, and we simply. So that's Pepe's reality. It certainly does bite, as does Alistair Crooke's, okay, reality. Both of those realities are in line with the reality sketched by Jeffrey Sachs, okay, to start with. So, what have we to say about all this? I think what we have to say is that it's better for the West to withdraw, okay, from Europe, to stop the conflict, okay, in Western Asia, and to go back home to solve our problems, okay, at home before they fester any farther. So here we are at our comments. Andy says, or April says, hi, Joe, I'm about to share. The mad scientists of UK and US are going to have to end their Zion-Nazi Frankenstein that they created. April. Zion-Nazi Frankenstein. Sorry, still can't see for squat on this little phone. April says, I would have died laughing if Pepe would have described Zelensky as a dirty, sweaty wife beater. I don't know if he is a wife beater. He's only been described as the sweaty sweatshirt by Pepe. Evelina says a lot of people don't know that there is a U.S. nuclear submarine stationed off the base in Guantanamo. Well, that may be, but what can the U.S. nuclear submarine stationed off the base in Guantanamo do about possible close-up attacks by Russians, on the East Coast? The source, is Mesa Redonda. Now, if that nuclear submarine uh, was under the waters of the Black Sea, then maybe it could do something in retaliation. The source is Mesa Redondo. Evelyn says AKI Roundtable. I will knock it forward. Sorry. It's not supposed to be there, says Evelina. April says, sorry, I forgot to say, dirty, sweaty, wife beater t-shirt. So yeah, things are now a little tense, in the Caribbean, just as they are in the areas surrounding Russia. Maybe the show of force will persuade our Americans that we have to negotiate with the Russians. It's time for real negotiation. Evelina points out the Russian fleet has the country's permission. The base is illegal. Lana says, hi, old Joe. Don't forget to tell everyone you will be on with Steve Keen tomorrow. Thank you for reminding me, Lana. Yes, indeed. I'm going to be on Steve Keen's show tomorrow at 12 noon, Eastern time, for a 2-hour show as the guest of Steve Keen and his friends. And the topic of the show will be real fiscal responsibility. And we'll be talking about a variety of topics, actually, because real fiscal responsibility, with a few definitions, it gets you into talking about all kinds of MMT subjects, including public purpose, including how you do impact evaluations, and a variety of things. So we should be pretty deep into MMT in that particular show, but also deep into MMT applications and MMT analyses, and also deep into to monetary sovereignty and why that's important and why it's important for policy. We're going to be into all that kind of stuff. It should be a really interesting show. And Evelina says the treaty expired decades ago. Yes, it did. Joe, do you think Russia knew the U.S. proxy in Ukraine would deplete the U.S.'s weapons and supplies? No. I think our military completely miscalculated the strength of the Russians. Our foreign policy people completely miscalculated the economic strength of the Russians. I think they also miscalculated the strength of the alliance between Russia and China, and they seemed ignorant of the alliance between Iran and Russia, or the very close ties, or the very close ties between North Korea and Russia, all of which helped Russia do very well in the war. I think that our foreign policy planners thought that Russia was going to fold in the face of the economic sanctions. So our planners really screwed up. And of course, the people who are paying the main price are the Ukrainians, who, by some estimate, have suffered 600,000 fatalities. And we know that right now the population of Ukraine has declined from 42 million to something like 20 million. I've heard estimates even lower than that because people have left for safer climes. They just haven't stayed inside of Ukraine for the war. Ukraine has a terrible problem of manpower right now. And we have a terrible problem of supply because years ago, we got rid of our manufacturing capability for full-time conventional war. And we relied on high-tech weapons instead. The Russians, of course, did not. They immediately repurposed their manufacturing capability to do military, to do arms, to do ammunition, and to manufacture it quickly on a 24-hour basis in their factories. And they are producing astonishing amounts of tanks and planes and ammunition and sophisticated weaponry, and running circles not only around us, but running circles around the whole collective West. They're outproducing the whole collective West. John B. says, has the U.S. bully got to be knocked down before they adjust to the reality of an unstoppable multipolar world? I hope not for all U.S. and European citizens. Well, I think in one way, John B., we're getting knocked down now. I mean, this defeat in Ukraine is our defeat in the end. We were unable to supply the weapons, the Ukrainians needed. We were unable to train the Ukrainians in a way that would be useful for stopping the Russians. And we failed in our military evaluations and our foreign policy evaluations. So we have been getting knocked down. We just don't want to recognize it. We're in denial. We're in that big river, and we don't seem to want to get out of it. It would be easy. I think a new administration could get out of it. But I don't know that I think a Biden administration can't get out of it. They've imprisoned themselves with their own propaganda. They're not going to change. If in the few months before the election, they were to admit error, it would sweep them out of office. They're going to be swept out anyway, but I think even more that would result in their getting swept out of office. On the other hand, Trump would probably end the war in Ukraine quickly. After all, the war wasn't his era. So he'll come in and he'll say, see what I did, how great I am. I ended this war overnight. And so that would be an improvement. Okay. But then he would try to turn to Israel and back Israel completely into the hilt and be completely unrealistic about the reality of the conflict in Western Asia. And he would probably put us into a big defeat in Western Asia, worse than what we're approaching now. Well, how about Jill Stein or Teddy Kennedy or Cornel West? I think when it comes to Teddy Kennedy, he still clings to this narrative of how virtuous the Israelis are. He would end the war in Ukraine very quickly, too. I'm quite sure of that. And he would be much more likely to recognize the economic reality of the multipolar world. In fact, I think he had a statement about it this week, recognizing the economic reality of the multipolar world and the military reality as well, and recognizing that we have to be a pole in the multipolar world, no more than that. Yep, I mean Bobby Kennedy. Didn't I say Bobby Kennedy? I didn't say Jack Kennedy, did I? I mean Bobby Kennedy. Yeah, yeah. Yes, but I meant Bobby Kennedy anyway. So, uh, on the other hand, when it comes to Israeli reality and Western Asian reality, oh, I said Teddy? Okay. When it comes, okay, when it comes uh, 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 to the reality that currently exists in Western Asia, it seems as though Bobby Kennedy is as full of illusion as the other two guys. Okay, at least when it comes to China, he wouldn't be as full of illusion. So, on foreign policy grounds, uh, we have 3 out of 3 disasters going on in foreign policy for Biden. We would have 2 of 3 disasters going on for Trump, because he's likely to be really, really aggressive towards China. And we probably have only 1 of 3 disasters in Bobby Kennedy's corner right now. And there may be some hope that he's going to divorce himself from one of these realities as the campaign goes on. I don't think he's honestly faced the reality of the Gaza yet. And when he does, okay, I think he's going to change very abruptly. But we aren't seeing it yet. We're not seeing it yet. There was a recent appearance on Piers Morgan's show, and he seemed to still be spouting the same old nonsense. He's being harsher on Netanyahu, he's being harsher on the regime, but he still is into the illusion of full support for the Israelis. So that's really bad. Russia and China don't inflate their GDP with hollow financial numbers like the West. China's shipbuilding capacity is 200 times that of the U.S. Doesn't surprise me at all. We dismantled our shipbuilding capacity. Going all the way back to the 1950s, we began dismantling it. It was ridiculous. We thought, well, it's okay to give this business to other people. It was insane. It was just insane. John B. says all those false economic numbers created by applied neolib extreme capitalism have lulled U.S. government to a false, arrogant sense of Western invincibility. True. Absolutely true. I noticed that the numbers that Jeff Sachs was giving in his article appeared to be PPP numbers. He didn't say it, but they appeared to be PPP numbers because the Chinese economy was characterized as being 25% larger, than the U.S. economy. John B. said the reality of a hollowed out U.S. industrial capacity cannot be escaped. The U.S. will pay the price for decades to come. I don't know if we'll pay the price for decades to come, John B. It depends on how we react to it. We can build up, during World War II, we built up a fantastic industrial capacity, much greater than we had before, in just a few years. It was done, of course, on an emergency basis. We pulled out all stops. We used the full power of a fiat sovereign nation, to do it, because we went into fiat sovereignty mode in World War II. Well, we are a fiat sovereign now, and we can just do an emergency economic thing where we build out, our industrial capacity again, devote everything to building out industrial capacity, ration consumption, recognize that the lack of industrial capacity is our problem. And then that way, one would not have to pay the price for decades to come. We have to start doing industrial miracles the same way that China is doing them. We have to define ambitious goals. We have to mobilize the government in support of those goals. We have to have an industrial policy, and all this has to be backed by a willing Congress that is not bought by the oligarchs. We must have dumped the corruption very, very soon. Okay, it is 9 o'clock. I'm now going over to see if Dee needs help. This must be about the first time in a long time that I'm relatively on time. So I guess that's good. This is Friday night. I don't know if I'll see you tomorrow, since I'm going to have a 2-hour show from 12 to 2 over at Steve Keen's. I may not want to be with Dee tomorrow night, but I may still see you before Tuesday. But if not, I will certainly see you on Tuesday when I have an international relations program once again. Thank you very much for coming, and I'll see you soon. The U.S. cannot rebuild the required skills base for at least 10 years. China outputs the number of U.S. current engineers every year. John B., I didn't say we're going to outproduce China, but we can still build a fantastic industrial capacity in less than 10 years. I don't say we're going to be the equal to China. I don't expect that's ever going to happen. And the reason why is simple: population. They have 1.4 billion people. We have 335 billion people. And we just, even if we're just as efficient, as they're still going to output 4 times the number of engineers that we do. So there it is. That's the reality. Reality bites. Lana says good night. Good night, Lana. Thank you for the reminder. By the way, please like, share, and subscribe. And remember my Patreon account, patreon.com, Joe_Firestone. My Buy Me a Coffee account at buymeacoffee.com/Joe.Firestone. Okay, Lana says good night. And April says, good program as always, Joe. See ya. John B. says, ouch. Why ouch? Good night, all. I mean, we're not going to be the equal. We're not going to be the equal of China. China is going to be the world's great power, but they won't be the hegemon, because there are going to be many poles in this system. The United States will be a powerful nation for some time to come. Our power will probably be primarily here in the hemisphere. We need to be able to recognize that there are multiple poles in this hemisphere also. I think one pole is going to be Mexico, and another pole is going to be Canada. I'm sorry, not Canada. I meant actually Brazil, of course. So I think there are going to be 3 poles in this particular hemisphere, and we got to get used to that and get off the crazy Monroe Doctrine. It's dated. It's gone. We got to say goodbye to the Monroe Doctrine. We can't expect to be one of the African powers, a power in that region. We can't expect to be a power in Western Asia. It's not going to happen. I think the Europeans have to get control of their own area themselves. and then they will become one of the multiple poles in the international system. I think there are going to be a number of regional powers. China is going to be the first among equals. Okay, I think Russia will retain its military power for some time to come, and the power produced by its natural resources for some time to come. They're going to develop very, very, very fast now, and we're going to have to unleash our full productive power to keep pace with these other nations. And Lana says, "You sound like Mearsheimer now." Of course I sound like Mearsheimer. I am, after all, a realist. I'm not the kind of realist that Mearsheimer is, but there's a lot of overlap between us in terms of the way we think. If there's any difference, it's because my approach to international relations is and has been since I first began teaching the subject in 1965, a systems approach to international relations. And I'm still an exponent of that kind of approach in international relations. Yes, Lana, I used to teach international relations, and I was a damn good IR teacher too when I taught it. Okay, John B. said, "Aren't we glad that China, is not belligerent?" Yes, I'm very glad. Very glad that they're not looking for war, that they want to do business, and they want to lift their people out of poverty entirely. I'm very glad their leadership seems to be dedicated to the welfare of China, and even if to a lesser extent, to the welfare of the rest of the world. I mean, they seem to have identified their national interest with lifting up the rest of the world. I think we have to go back to that. I think at one time, just after the Second World War, uh, many of us thought in those terms. And I think we have to go back to that. John B. says, if Turkey joins BRICS, NATO may well collapse. Turkey is the second largest armed force in NATO. Completely agree. And I think Turkey is going to join BRICS. I don't know if they're going to join BRICS in October, but there's a great chat. Let's chat when you are finished with Dee's show. Okay, I may have time. I still have a little work I want to do for Steve's show tomorrow. If there is time to chat, though, I certainly will get a hold of you, Alana. Okay? Okay, so we are. I'm still in this stream, so I'm going to end it now.